No one in town really understood why Grace Whitaker still came to the auction. Most days, the empty Kansas wind seemed to have stripped her down to the bone, just like the barren fields stretching for miles around her rundown farmhouse. People whispered about her, a widow, 54, who once taught high school literature and quoted poetry even to grocery clerks, now living alone on land where nothing grew but thistles. The memories of her husband and daughter lingered in every room like smoke that wouldn't clear. Reminders of the fire that had gutted her world a decade ago. But on this particular Saturday, Grace's heart pounded with a restlessness she couldn't explain. She parked her old Ford under a cottonwood near the fairground fence, pausing to touch the faded photograph tucked into her wallet. Her husband's lopsided grin, her daughter's untamed curls. "You wouldn't believe what this place looks like without you," she murmured. Then she squared her shoulders and walked into the noise and dust. Cattle bawled from makeshift pens, auctioneers shouted numbers like spells, and the air smelled of sun-baked hay and sweat. The crowd parted for Grace out of habit more than kindness. She wandered past crates of squawking chickens, a couple of rusty tractors, and finally, the livestock holding pens. That's where she saw him, a gaunt gray horse, ribs jutting beneath a tattered hide, head hanging low as if the weight of living was too much. He stood apart from the other horses, wild and unwanted, a jagged scar slashing across his left flank. The local boys laughed, nudging each other. "That's old Ghost, worth less than glue," one snickered. Another, older rancher shook his head. "I heard he's cursed. Belonged to a drunk who whipped him half crazy, then let him run wild after a tornado wrecked his barn." Grace felt something stir deep inside. A strange, sharp ache, equal parts pity and recognition. She ignored the laughter, stepping closer until she could see the horse's eyes, haunted, hollow, yet stubbornly alive. For a long moment, they simply regarded each other, two souls out of step with the world. A man in a straw hat spat near her boots. "You thinking of bidding, Grace? Don't waste your money. That animal's got no fight left." She didn't answer, only leaned on the fence and watched as the auctioneer barked out the starting price. So low, it drew more jeers. No one bid. The auctioneer shrugged, impatient. "Come on, folks. What'll you give for this sorry nag? Somebody take him off our hands." Grace heard herself call out, $50. The crowd stilled. Someone coughed. Then laughter rippled around her, cutting and sharp. "She's lost it, completely," a woman hissed. "Maybe she wants a ghost to match that haunted old house of hers," another sneered. Ignoring them, Grace raised her hand, gaze never leaving the horse. "I said 50, she repeated, voice steady. "Sold, to the crazy widow." The gavel slammed down. Grace fished crumpled bills from her purse and handed them over. The stable hand eyed her with something like pity as he handed her the worn rope halter. She approached the horse slowly, whispering nonsense, her palm open. He shied at first, but didn't bolt. Up close, she could see the flecks of white in his mane, the twisted scar on his leg, and a shiver that went through his body as she touched his neck. "Let's go home," she said quietly. As Grace led Ghost out of the auction yard, the crowd parted again. Some faces twisted with disbelief, others with scorn. One man barked, "You'll regret it, Whitaker!" But she kept walking, chin high, the wind catching her silver hair and the horse's tangled tail. Along the dirt road back to her farm, neighbors gathered on porches or paused in fields to watch. Grace felt their stares like pinpricks, heard their whispers drift on the breeze. Words like crazy hopeless and lost cause. She pressed on, every step echoing with doubts that weren't entirely her own. Halfway home, a pickup pulled alongside. It was Dan McCoy, her neighbor for 20 years, his weathered face creased with concern. "Grace, you sure about this?" He called through the window. "That horse looks half dead." She managed a faint smile. "So did I once." Dan hesitated, then drove on, shaking his head. Grace's legs trembled from the effort of walking, and more than once Ghost stopped, shuddering as if every memory hurt. But something in the way he looked back at her, silent, searching, made her squeeze the lead rope tighter. The sun dipped low by the time they reached the farm. The barn stood empty and drafty, ghosts of laughter and warmth haunting the corners. Grace unlatched the stall, led Ghost inside and spread fresh straw, humming a lullaby she hadn't sung in years. She fetched a bucket of water, poured grain into the trough, and leaned on the stall door, watching as Ghost ignored both, staring at the far wall with hollow eyes. That night, as the prairie wind rattled the window panes, Grace sat at her kitchen table, hands curled around a chipped mug. The town would be talking, she knew. Maybe she was foolish. Maybe broken people and broken animals belonged together, if only so the world could forget them both. Yet as she looked out at the barn, where a gray shadow shifted restlessly in the straw, she felt, against all reason, a flicker of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of something neither she nor Ghost could see just yet. And somewhere in the silence, she whispered, "We'll prove them wrong, won't we?" The next morning, Grace awoke to the familiar ache in her joints and the even sharper ache of dread, wondering if she'd find Ghost still breathing. She shuffled across the cold kitchen floor, pulled on her boots, and stepped outside. The Kansas sunrise was all fire and gold, but its beauty felt distant, almost mocking. The barn was so silent, she half feared the worst. Grace's heart hammered as she slid open the weathered door. Ghost stood exactly where she'd left him, head low, sides heaving. The grain in the trough was untouched, the water barely sipped. The horse's eyes followed her, dark and impenetrable. She tried again, spoke softly, offered apple slices, and scattered hay in hopes he'd take just a nibble. But Ghost turned away, pressing himself into the corner as if trying to disappear. His whole body seemed to tremble with defeat. Grace reached out. He flinched, and she drew back, wounded by the depth of his fear. By noon, word had spread across town. A truck pulled up by the fence and 3 local men leaned against the hood, arms crossed, faces full of skepticism. Grace kept her chin up as they called out. "You might as well give up, Whitaker," one jeered. "He'll never come around." Another snorted. "Waste of money. Should have bought yourself a new roof instead of a ghost horse." Grace forced herself to smile. "Kindness isn't wasted," she said, though her voice wavered. The men shook their heads and drove off, their laughter lingering. Grace felt her resolve waver. Doubt crept in, unwelcome and cold. Why had she done this? Was she chasing shadows again, desperate for meaning where there was none? That night, after a long day of coaxing Ghost with carrots, gentle words, and soft lullabies, she sat at the kitchen table with her old photo album. Her husband's letters were tucked between pages, yellowed paper, fading ink. She traced the lines of his handwriting, searching for comfort. Something slid from between the pages, a letter she'd forgotten, and a black and white photograph. She blinked in surprise. The photo showed a powerful stallion, fierce and proud, standing beside her husband in front of the old barn, scrawled on the back, "Midnight's Legacy. For our future, love, Tom." The letter, written in her husband's steady hand, spoke of dreams to build a bloodline of strong, resilient horses, hope for the future they'd never have. A sudden thought struck her. Could it be? She turned to the faded envelope, scanned the date, then looked again at Ghost in the barn. The scar, the coloring, it matched. Her heart began to race. She dug deeper, finding a receipt from years ago. Her husband had sold the last of his horses after the fire, desperate for cash. Was Ghost, could he be, one of Midnight's descendants? The next day, Grace hurried to the local library, scouring old auction records, tracing sales and bloodlines. Every clue seemed to confirm her suspicion. Ghost was the last living link to her husband's dreams, a piece of the family she'd thought lost forever. The revelation burned through her sadness, igniting something fierce and protective within her. But fate wasn't about to let her rest easy. That night, a thunderstorm rolled over the plains, wind howling, rain slashing at the windows. The barn groaned and rattled under the assault. Grace's nerves were raw, and she couldn't sleep. Each crash of thunder seemed to rattle the old farmhouse to its bones. Suddenly, a deafening crack split the air, the sound of splintering wood and shattering glass. Grace leapt from bed, adrenaline surging. She saw from the window that lightning had struck the far end of the barn. Flames licked the rafters, smoke billowing into the storm. "Ghost!" she screamed, racing into the maelstrom without hesitation. Mud sucked at her boots as she stumbled across the yard, arms raised against the wind. Rain soaked her to the skin in seconds, but she pressed on, heart pounding in her ears. Inside the barn, smoke stung her eyes and lungs. She could barely see through the chaos, but Ghost's wild, terrified whinny cut through everything. He was trapped beneath a tangle of fallen beams, hooves scrambling, eyes wide with panic. Grace's hands shook as she grabbed a pitchfork, prying at the beams. "Hold on! I'm here! Don't you give up now!" she shouted, coughing hard. The fire crept closer, heat biting at her skin. She pulled, pushed, and clawed until her muscles screamed. A beam shifted, and for a split second she locked eyes with Ghost. He could run. He could trample her. Instead, the horse took a trembling step toward her, then another. Grace reached for his halter, ignoring the searing heat. "Please, just trust me," she pleaded. Ghost shuddered, then lurched forward, squeezing past the splintered wreckage. Grace threw herself into the storm, dragging him behind her. They burst into the rain, flames at their backs. She collapsed onto the muddy ground, clutching Ghost's neck, sobbing with relief. Neighbors, drawn by the lightning and the fire, arrived minutes later. Some rushed to help, others just stared. Grace barely noticed. She knelt beside Ghost, whispering thanks over and over. For the first time, the horse leaned into her touch, as if finding comfort in her presence. The barn was half lost, but Ghost, and something in Grace's heart, had survived. As dawn broke, she wiped soot from her face, feeling a strength she hadn't known in years. The town might think her foolish, but in the ruins of the storm she found hope and the fragile beginnings of trust. And so, battered but unbroken, Grace and Ghost began their journey together. Not just as two survivors, but as family. The days after the fire passed in a blur of exhaustion and slow recovery. Half the barn was gone, charred beams and twisted metal standing like gravestones in the Kansas mud. But against all odds, Ghost was alive. Grace tended to his wounds with careful, trembling hands. wrapping burns with salve, cleaning the scratches and bruises where the beams had fallen. Each touch was a silent promise. I won't give up on you. Ghost was still wary, but something had shifted. He didn't shy away from her presence as often. Sometimes he let his muzzle rest lightly on her shoulder while she worked, his breath warm on her skin. Other times, he simply stood in the weak sunlight outside what was left of the barn, watching the prairie as if searching for a sign. Grace read to him every afternoon. She sat on a battered lawn chair with an old copy of Walt Whitman or Robert Frost, letting her voice fill the air with words about hope, pain, and rebirth. The strongest souls, she read one day, are seared with scars. She wasn't sure if the horse understood, but he seemed calmer when she spoke, his tail flicking gently in the summer breeze. Neighbors still whispered as they passed her drive, some out of pity, some out of malice. Grace didn't care. She was learning, day by day, to close her ears to the world's judgment. The rhythm of caring for Ghost, of rebuilding the barn plank by plank, gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't known in years. One sticky afternoon, as she scrubbed a muddy feed bucket by the well, Grace heard soft footsteps behind her. She turned, startled, and found a girl, maybe 9 or 10, standing at the gate. She was skinny, with pale hair pulled into a messy ponytail and a backpack slung over one shoulder. "Hi," the girl said, not meeting Grace's eyes. Grace wiped her hands on her jeans and approached. "Hello there. You lost?" The girl shook her head. "I live down the road. My name's Emily." Grace searched her memory and realized she'd seen Emily before, walking alone to the one-room schoolhouse or sitting on the swings at the church playground. Rumor had it Emily's mother had died the winter before, and her father worked long hours at the mill, leaving her to fend for herself most days. "Would you like some lemonade?" Grace asked gently. Emily nodded, slipping through the gate. She followed Grace to the porch, settling on the bottom step with the air of someone used to making herself small. Grace poured 2 glasses, handed one over, and sat beside her. They drank in silence for a moment, listening to cicadas whine in the grass. "That's a pretty horse," Emily said quietly, nodding toward Ghost. He was grazing near the fence line, scars visible even from a distance. Grace smiled, glancing at the horse. "His name's Ghost. He's been through a lot." Emily traced circles in the dust with her toe. "My mom liked horses. She used to say they could tell when someone was hurting." Grace's heart ached for the girl. I think she was right. Ghost and I were both trying to heal. The words seemed to hang in the air, soft but powerful. Emily finished her lemonade and asked, "Can I help you feed him?" Grace hesitated, then nodded. Together they walked toward the barn. Grace handed Emily a handful of oats. "Hold out your palm flat. He's gentle if you don't startle him." Emily did as instructed, holding her breath as Ghost approached. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the horse nudged her hand, lips searching for food. Emily giggled, a shy sound that made Grace's chest tighten with something like hope. As days turned into weeks, Emily became a regular presence. She arrived after school with apples in her backpack and stories about her day. Sometimes she brought drawings, crude, colorful sketches of horses running through fields. She and Grace cleaned stalls together, brushed Ghost's coat, and filled the trough with fresh water from the well. Ghost seemed to sense Emily's sadness. He let her braid ribbons into his mane and nuzzled her cheek when she cried, which happened more often than she wanted to admit. Grace watched the two of them and felt the walls around her own heart begin to crumble. One Saturday, while repairing the barn, Grace found Emily sitting cross-legged in the straw, reading aloud from a tattered copy of Black Beauty. Ghost stood nearby, listening with ears pricked forward, the picture of calm. Grace sat quietly on a hay bale, letting the sound of Emily's voice wash over her like rain. In the evenings, Grace and Emily cooked simple meals together: beans, cornbread, fried potatoes, and ate by lantern light. They shared stories of the past. Grace spoke of her husband and daughter, her teaching days, the fire that changed everything. Emily told tales of her mother's kindness and her dreams of learning to ride. Sometimes the darkness pressed close, full of memories and ghosts both real and imagined. But in those moments, Grace reminded herself that healing was slow, a stubborn seed pushing up through cracked earth. She clung to small victories: Ghost eating from Emily's hand, Emily's laughter echoing in the empty barn, the first shoot of green grass in a patch of blackened soil. One night, as a warm wind rattled the shutters, Grace watched Emily and Ghost standing together in the moonlight, two silhouettes joined by hope and loss. She realized that against all odds, her lonely farm had become a refuge for a wounded girl, a broken horse, and a woman who believed that sometimes the hardest things to heal were the ones most worth saving. The world outside could gossip and judge all it wanted. Inside the boundary of that battered fence, 3 souls, once lost, had begun the slow, brave work of finding their way home. Summer on the Kansas prairie always brought a strange quiet, a hush between the rattle of harvest machinery and the first snap of autumn winds. For Grace, those long afternoons dragged by like slow-moving clouds, each one heavy with memory. She had never been one to dwell, not before the fire. But now, with Ghost recovering in the paddock and Emily's laughter echoing in the half-built barn, memories rose up in her like old ghosts. Her husband's warm voice, her daughter's wild giggles, the crackle of flames in the night. Sometimes she awoke in the dark, heart racing, half convinced she'd heard their footsteps on the porch or smelled her husband's aftershave drifting down the hall. The days with Ghost and Emily gave her purpose. Still, in quiet moments, the past wrapped around her like smoke. She'd find herself staring at the empty chair at the kitchen table, tracing the cracks in her wedding ring, wondering if she'd ever truly find her way back to the woman she once was. One morning, as Grace poured oats into Ghost's feed bucket, she caught sight of her reflection in the cracked barn window. She hardly recognized herself, the silver in her hair, the lines carved deep by grief and hard work. She saw, too, a flicker of something else, a faint hope. It startled her more than she cared to admit. Ghost, for his part, had changed too. The haunted look was fading from his eyes, replaced by something softer. He moved with more confidence, his coat growing glossy under Emily's careful brushing. He even nickered now when Grace approached, a sound she treasured. But healing, she knew, wasn't a straight line. Some days, Ghost would spook at a sudden noise or stand motionless for hours, staring at the far hills. On those days, Grace felt the old ache return, a cold certainty that loss never truly left you. It just hid for a while. Emily sensed it too. The girl had become like a shadow, drifting between chores and reading sessions, never quite asking for comfort, but never refusing it either. One night, as a storm gathered on the horizon, Emily lingered by the porch after supper, watching the lightning flicker in the distance. "My mom hated storms," she said quietly. "She used to sing to me real soft, until I fell asleep." Grace wanted to reach for her, but instead she handed Emily a patchwork quilt and said, You're safe here, sweetheart. Storms can't hurt us tonight. For a moment, they sat side by side, the thunder rolling over them, bound by the invisible threads of shared sorrow. A few days later, the farm's quiet was interrupted by the rumble of a county sheriff's truck. Sheriff Paul Harris was a fixture in these parts. Tall, gentle-voiced, a little grayer around the temples than Grace remembered. He parked by the barn and carried a sack of feed and a box of canned goods. "Morning, Grace," he said, tipping his hat. "Heard you've been through a rough spell." Grace shrugged, glancing at the barn. "We're still standing." Paul smiled. "That's more than most can say." He walked the fence line with her, asking about repairs, checking on Ghost, and listening with quiet patience as she recounted the fire, the rescue, and the slow return to normalcy. "You always did have grit," he said, studying her. "But I worry, Grace. It's not weakness to ask for help." Grace bristled, then softened. "I've got Emily and Ghost now. We're managing." Paul nodded, setting the supplies down by the porch. "I'll check in from time to time. Folks in town might talk, but some of us know what it's like to carry heavy things." His visit lingered with her all day. That evening, as she watched Emily and Ghost in the paddock, Emily reading from her latest book, Ghost listening as if he understood every word, Grace felt something unfamiliar. The beginnings of gratitude, thin as new grass, stubborn as hope. That night, as the prairie wind sang through the broken barn slats, Grace sat at her desk and pulled out her old teaching journals. She flipped through lesson plans and essays, poems her students had written. Each page was a reminder of who she'd been, a teacher, a mother, a wife, and who she might still become. She scribbled a note on the back of an envelope. "Healing isn't forgetting. It's learning to carry love and loss together." She left the note on the windowsill, where the moonlight could find it. Days grew shorter. The farm, battered but alive, became a quiet refuge, not just for Grace, but for anyone who needed a place to belong. Neighbors stopped by with tools or pies, always leaving with a story about Ghost's slow transformation or Emily's clever questions. Grace took comfort in these rhythms. Every day she mucked stalls, mended fences, made coffee for herself, and hot chocolate for Emily. She learned to find beauty in small things, the gleam of Ghost's mane in the sunlight, the rise and fall of Emily's breath as she napped beneath an old oak, the hum of life returning to a place once silenced by tragedy. Sometimes at dusk, she'd walk to the edge of her land and stand very still, listening for the voices of the past. They came softer now, less insistent. Instead of pain, she felt their presence as gentle encouragement, a reminder that she was still here, still trying, still worthy of happiness. One evening, after Emily had gone home and Ghost was bedded down in fresh straw, Grace lit a lantern and sat by the barn door, watching the stars blink into being. The air was cool, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope. Not just for herself, but for the fragile family she was slowly building, one act of courage at a time. As the night deepened, she whispered into the darkness, "We're healing, aren't we?" And though no one answered, Grace believed it was true. By early September, the town of Maple Creek had made Grace Whitaker and her strange horse the subject of every whispered conversation and kitchen table rumor for miles around. Some days, when Grace walked into Miller's general store for flour or feed, the room would go silent, and eyes would follow her like crows watching a wounded rabbit. Other times, she'd overhear fragments of talk, lost her mind, wasting good land on that useless nag. Should have left well enough alone. At first, Grace tried to ignore it. She focused on the rhythms of her days, feeding Ghost, fixing the battered fence, helping Emily with her spelling and math. She told herself that the world had always been cruel to things it didn't understand. But doubt crept in like a chill beneath the door, growing with every sideways glance and forced smile. One morning, as the sun burned the fog off the fields, Grace found Emily waiting at the gate, face pale and tight. She clutched her backpack like a lifeline. "They were making fun of me again," Emily said, voice brittle. "At school. Said I was weird for spending so much time with a crazy old lady and a broken-down horse." Grace's heart clenched. She knelt, brushing Emily's hair back from her face. "There's nothing wrong with loving things that need love," she said quietly. "It takes courage. Not everyone understands that." Emily sniffed, nodding. Together they went to the barn, where Ghost nickered a greeting, his coat catching the gold of the morning sun. Emily's mood lifted as she fed him apples and brushed out his tangled mane. Still, the words hung between them like a stubborn fog. The day took a turn near noon. A battered blue pickup rumbled down the road and stopped by Grace's fence. A woman climbed out. A stranger to Emily, but instantly familiar to Grace. Martha Evans, the horse's former owner, was tall and wiry, her face hard as prairie stone. "Martha," Grace called, wary but polite. "What brings you out this way?" Martha eyed Ghost, her gaze sharp and appraising. "Heard you bought my old problem," she said, her voice flat. "I figured I owed you a warning." Grace squared her shoulders. "What kind of warning?" Martha's mouth twisted. "That horse isn't just bad luck. Folks around here don't forget bloodlines. Your husband, he was proud of that line, but it brought nothing but trouble. Some people want to see it gone for good. Others—" Her eyes flickered to Emily and back. "Well, let's just say, if word gets out how special that horse really is, you'll have more than gossip to worry about." Grace felt a cold wave of fear. "He's not for sale, if that's what you're after." Martha barked a humorless laugh. "Wasn't asking. Just be careful, Grace. Secrets like his have a way of drawing the wrong kind of attention." With that, she climbed back in her truck and disappeared down the lane, a cloud of dust hanging in her wake. Grace stood frozen, the old fear curling in her belly. The rest of the week brought new troubles. Twice strangers came to the farm, men with slick boots and city accents, offering stacks of cash for Ghost. They circled the paddock, appraising the horse like a commodity. One man winked at Grace, his words oily. "Name your price, ma'am. That old mare's got pedigree, and there's folks who'll pay plenty to get their hands on him." Grace stood firm, her voice sharp. "He's not for sale. Move along." When the men grew pushy, threatening to call animal control or worse, she called Sheriff Paul. He arrived within the hour, his presence alone enough to send the men packing. Afterward, he lingered by the barn, concern etched into his features. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "If Ghost is really the last of Tom's line, there are people who'll stop at nothing to get him. Breeders, old rivals, folks with more greed than sense." Grace nodded, swallowing her anxiety. "Let them come. I'm not giving up on him." But the threats wore on her. One evening, she found the latch to Ghost's stall tampered with, the gate swinging open. Only Emily's quick thinking and Ghost's growing trust kept him from running into the road. Another time, a spray-painted message appeared on the side of her barn. "Let go of the past." It was more than a warning. It was a challenge. Grace felt the weight of every decision pressing down on her. Was she putting Emily in danger? Was she right to fight so hard for a horse everyone else had written off? Emily, too, was feeling the strain. She came home from school one afternoon, face red and eyes wet. "They said you're crazy, and Ghost should be put down. They said you're making things worse for everybody." Grace hugged her tightly. Sometimes people say cruel things when they're afraid of what they don't understand. But we know the truth, don't we? We know what's worth saving. Ghost, sensing the tension, grew restless, pawing the earth, whinnying at shadows. At night, Grace lay awake, listening to the wind rattle the windows, wondering if she could truly protect those she loved from the darkness gathering at her door. Then, one night, as rain drummed on the roof and lightning flashed on the horizon, Grace made a decision. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't hide. The world could keep its rumors and doubts. She would stand her ground. For Ghost, for Emily, for the memory of the family she'd lost, and the fragile, precious new family she'd found. The storms outside were fierce, but inside that battered farmhouse, a stubborn hope burned brighter than ever. Grace pulled her old teaching journals from the shelf, set a kettle to boil, and began to write a letter. To herself, to her late husband, to anyone who might one day need to remember. Love is worth fighting for, even when the world calls you foolish. And outside, in the muddy paddock, Ghost lifted his head to the wind, as if he too was learning how to hope again. If Grace had learned anything in her 54 years on this earth, it was that sometimes you had to draw a line in the dirt and let the world know where you stood. By late September, it was clear that the talk in Maple Creek wasn't going to fade quietly. If anything, the rumors were growing teeth. The town's monthly community meeting was held in the basement of First Baptist, where folding chairs and stale coffee were as much a tradition as the gossip itself. Grace rarely attended. She'd spent years keeping to herself, letting the world pass by her battered farm. But when she heard her own name, her farm, her horse, her sanity, being debated in whispers at Miller's store, she made up her mind. Enough was enough. That evening, Grace washed the dirt from her hands, changed into her best, though still faded, dress, and walked to the church hall with her chin up and her back straight. Emily came too, clutching Ghost's favorite halter for luck. They sat near the back, unnoticed at first, until the meeting began. Pastor Mitchell opened with a prayer, then the usual talk about the harvest, the new water tower, potholes on County Road 7. But soon enough, the subject turned to Grace. It started with Mrs. Covington, Maple Creek's queen of concern, clearing her throat. "I just think," she began, "that some people in this community are taking unnecessary risks. That old horse is dangerous, and frankly, we can't have children visiting a property where someone's judgment might be impaired." A few heads nodded. Others glanced at Grace, waiting. She felt her cheeks flush, anger prickling beneath her skin. Before she could rise, Emily spoke up, voice thin but clear. "He's not dangerous. He's scared. And so am I sometimes. That doesn't mean we're broken." The room fell silent. Grace squeezed Emily's hand, then stood. She looked around, at the neighbors who'd watched her grieve, the classmates of her late daughter, the men who'd once worked her fields alongside her husband. She took a breath. "I know what you all say about me," she began, her voice trembling just enough to betray how much this moment cost her. "Maybe you think I'm crazy for loving that horse, for taking in a child who needs a safe place. Maybe you think I should sell out, give up, move on. But I won't." She looked down, searching for the right words. "Ghost isn't just a horse. He's the last piece of the family I lost. He's proof that something broken can be made whole again if you have enough faith and enough patience. And Emily, she's got more courage than any grown man here. She comes every day, rain or shine, to help me heal something inside myself I thought was gone for good. Grace's voice gained strength as she spoke. You all talk about tradition and community, about values and decency. Well, what does it say about us if we turn our backs on the weak or the lost? What does it say if we only care for what's easy and beautiful? Ghost was abandoned and abused. So was I in my own way. But we're still here. We're still fighting. There was a long, uneasy silence. Then, to Grace's surprise, Dan McCoy spoke up from the back. She's right. That old horse looks better than he has in years. And Emily, well, she's always been a good kid. Maybe we ought to stop judging and start helping. Others nodded, some grudgingly, some with genuine warmth, but not everyone was convinced. Mr. Anderson, who bred quarter horses and had eyed Ghost since the auction, spoke up. Look, Grace, nobody wants to see you hurt, but that bloodline, your husband's line, it's valuable. You could sell that horse and fix your roof, maybe even retire. Holding on to the past is dangerous. Think of the community. Think of Emily. Grace shook her head. I have thought of her. I've thought of all of you. And I'll say it plain, Ghost stays with me. Not because of what he might be worth, but because of what he means. He's not for sale. Not ever. Emily's eyes shone with gratitude and pride. But outside the hall, in the shadows, there were other voices. That night, as Grace and Emily walked home, Emily told her the truth. Some of the older kids at school, they started calling me Ghost Girl. They say if I keep coming here, no one will ever talk to me again. Grace hugged her fiercely. Let them talk. The people who matter know the truth. But it hurt, knowing the price Emily paid for loyalty. The next day, Emily returned from school with bruises on her arm and a torn notebook. They pushed me in the mud, she admitted, voice trembling. Said you'd go crazy and hurt me. Said Ghost should be shot. Grace's rage boiled over. She called the principal, demanded answers, but the school could offer only apologies and promises. Emily, ever brave, insisted she wanted to keep coming. He needs me, she said, meaning Ghost. But Grace understood she meant herself, too. So Grace did what she always did. She fought back with kindness. She invited Emily's father over for dinner, showed him how safe the farm was, how much his daughter mattered. Slowly, others followed. Martha Evans came by with fresh eggs and, more quietly, advice on how to handle trespassers. Pastor Mitchell sent his sons to help mend the barn. Each small act of support was a victory, but the opposition didn't vanish. Grace knew it wouldn't. The farm remained a battleground, one where the real fight wasn't for land or livestock, but for dignity, belonging, and the right to hold on to hope. That autumn, as leaves turned gold and the air grew crisp, Grace stood taller. The wind might howl and the town might gossip, but within the battered fence of her home, she claimed her ground. She would protect Ghost and Emily no matter what it cost her, and somewhere in the distance, as the sun set behind broken clouds, Grace heard her husband's voice in memory. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is just not give up. She smiled, wiping her hands on her jeans, ready for whatever came next. Autumn deepened on the Kansas plains, the nights growing sharp and the air carrying the smoky tang of burning leaves. Grace had never liked the smell. It brought back the nightmare of that long-ago fire, the one that stole her family and left only ashes and silence behind. Now, Each night as she tucked Ghost and Emily in safe, that old fear pressed close, curling around her heart. But it wasn't just the ghosts of the past that troubled Grace. Ever since her stand at the church hall, threats had grown bolder. Men she didn't recognize began driving slow past her farm at all hours. Once, she found a beer bottle smashed against her mailbox and a note, blocky handwriting scrawled on a torn feed sack. "You'll regret it. Sell the horse." Grace reported it to Sheriff Paul, who promised to keep an eye out. But the sheriff was only one man, and trouble had a way of sneaking in when you least expected it. On a Saturday night in late October, as the wind rattled the shutters and rain swept across the roof, Grace sat at her kitchen table, grading papers for Emily. Emily was stretched on her stomach before the fire, humming softly as she colored a picture of Ghost, rearing bravely on the prairie. They both jumped at the sudden, frantic banging at the door. Grace opened it to find Dan McCoy, rainwater dripping from his battered hat. "Grace, there's something wrong at the barn," he gasped. Heart pounding, Grace grabbed her flashlight and raced outside with Emily right behind her. The acrid smell hit them before they reached the barn, smoke thick and choking. Through the storm, a red glare pulsed against the clouds. The hay barn was on fire, flames leaping from the windows and sparks blowing dangerously close to the old wooden fence. Ghost was screaming, his cries piercing the darkness. Without thinking, Grace shoved open the gate and ran toward the inferno, Emily right beside her. Dan tried to hold them back, but Grace wouldn't listen. She remembered too clearly what it felt like to lose everything to fire. She couldn't lose Ghost. Not now. The barn was a wall of heat and blinding light. Emily choked on the smoke, but refused to turn back, clinging to Grace's shirt. Ghost's stall was jammed, the old wood swollen from rain and warped from heat. Grace slammed her shoulder into the door, again and again, splinters stabbing her arms. Emily screamed Ghost's name, waving a blanket to shield his eyes from the fire. Just as the roof groaned overhead, ready to collapse, the door gave way. Ghost burst from the stall, wild-eyed, but instead of bolting for safety, he swung around, pressing close to Grace and Emily. A burning beam crashed down nearby. Ghost whinnied and planted himself between the girls and the flames, refusing to leave without them. Neighbors had begun to arrive, faces stark in the firelight. Someone called the volunteer fire department. Dan McCoy and Pastor Mitchell rushed in with buckets and shovels, forming a desperate line. Sheriff Paul's pickup skidded into the drive, red lights strobing, and he leaped into action, directing the crowd and spraying down the fence to keep the fire from spreading. Grace and Emily, coughing and soot-covered, clung to Ghost as he herded them from danger. They reached the safety of the paddock, collapsing in the mud as the barn roof finally caved with a thunderous crash, embers swirling up into the night. The fire blazed until dawn, but thanks to the townsfolk's efforts, the house and main barn were saved. The hay barn was a total loss, a smoldering ruin. Ghost stood watch over Grace and Emily all night, battered but uninjured, never straying from their side. It was as if, in the very worst moment, the horse who'd once been lost to fear found his courage. After sunrise, Sheriff Paul took Grace aside. "I found these by the barn," he said, holding up a pack of matches and a torn flannel shirt. "There's no doubt. Someone set that fire on purpose. I have a pretty good idea who." He explained that rival breeders, jealous of Ghost's bloodline and desperate to see Grace gone, had banded together, feeding the town suspicions and hatred. "I'll handle the investigation," Paul promised, "but I need you to be careful. This isn't over." Grace nodded, swallowing the fear that threatened to close her throat. The fire had tested her, but it had also revealed something vital. She wasn't alone anymore. The people who'd shown up in the night, Dan, Pastor Mitchell, even some who'd once doubted her, stood with her now. They'd fought for her farm, her horse, her right to hope again. Emily clung to Ghost's neck, tears streaking her soot-stained cheeks. "He saved us," she whispered. "He could have run, but he didn't. He stayed." Grace knelt beside them, hugging them both. "He's family," she said, voice raw. "And so are you." That day, the story of the fire spread through Maple Creek. Some called it madness, others a miracle. But for Grace and Emily, it was proof. The farm was worth fighting for. Ghost, once the town's outcast, was now its unlikely hero. As the sun set behind the blackened shell of the hay barn, Grace knew the battle wasn't truly over. There would always be those who feared what they didn't understand, who valued money over love. But in that moment, surrounded by friends and by the living proof of her own stubborn hope, she understood what real courage was. Not the absence of fear, but standing firm in the face of it, refusing to let go. And for the first time in a decade, as dusk fell and Ghost grazed quietly beside Emily, Grace felt not just relief, but pride. The morning after the fire, the Whitaker farm felt strangely different. Quiet, but alive in a way Grace hadn't felt since before the tragedy that changed everything. The old hay barn was a smoldering skeleton, its charred remains a grim reminder of what had almost been lost. But the main barn and farmhouse still stood, and most importantly, so did Grace, Emily, and Ghost. For a long time it seemed the whole town was talking about the fire. At first, the whispers returned. Some blamed Grace for the trouble, saying she brought it on herself by holding on to a cursed horse. Others wondered aloud at her stubbornness, questioning why anyone would risk so much for an old mare and a strange, lonely girl. But as the story spread, the fire, the danger, and most of all, how Ghost had refused to abandon Grace and Emily, something began to shift. Neighbors who'd kept their distance now stopped by, bringing food, nails, and new lumber. Dan McCoy organized a barn raising, calling on anyone with hands or heart to spare. The day of the build, men and women arrived with tool belts and strong backs, and children trailed behind, eager to help. Even those who'd once gossiped about Grace joined in. By sundown, a new barn frame stood against the orange sky, each beam a testament to resilience and second chances. Emily was everywhere that day, hammering nails, fetching lemonade, and keeping Ghost calm as the noise and commotion swirled around him. The town's children gathered around her, asking to pet Ghost or hear the story of how he'd saved her from the fire. Emily, shy but proud, found herself at the center of something she'd never known before: belonging. Sheriff Paul, who had been quietly investigating the fire, finally brought news. The evidence he gathered, footprints, fingerprints, and a confession from one of the rival breeders, left no doubt that the blaze had been set intentionally. With the truth exposed, the last holdouts in town found their anger and suspicion redirected toward those truly responsible. But the most powerful shift came not from justice, but from the community's awakening to the story behind Ghost. Grace, prompted by Pastor Mitchell, agreed to speak at the county fair. On the makeshift stage, surrounded by hay bales and the smell of roasting corn, Grace found her voice. She told them about Ghost's bloodline, how her late husband had dreamed of a horse strong enough to survive anything, how the fire and grief had scattered that dream like ashes. She shared the letter and photograph she'd found. her voice trembling as she spoke of loss, of almost giving up, and finally, of hope's slow return. The crowd listened in stunned silence as Grace described the night of the fire. The moment Ghost, once broken and afraid, had stood between the flames and his family. Emily stood beside her, holding Ghost's lid, the horse's head bowed as if he understood every word. When Grace finished, something remarkable happened. The townsfolk stood and applauded, not just for her, but for the truth she'd carried alone for so long. One by one, people stepped forward to thank her for her honesty, to offer their help, and to apologize for their doubts. The farm changed after that. Neighbors became friends. Grace, once a figure of pity and suspicion, became a symbol of quiet strength. She opened the barn doors to anyone who needed help. A stray animal, a grieving child, a lonely soul. Emily started a small club, inviting kids to learn about horses, to help with chores, and to discover the healing power of kindness. One Saturday, as children painted the new barn with bright murals of wild horses and golden fields, Grace stood at the fence with Sheriff Paul. He smiled at the scene, the laughter, the bustle, the sense of home. "You've turned this place into something special," he said quietly. Grace nodded, her eyes bright with emotion. "I didn't do it alone." Pastor Mitchell arrived, arms loaded with boxes of donated books and supplies for the growing youth group. He grinned at Grace. "Would you speak again next Sunday?" About healing and second chances. Grace hesitated, then agreed. When Sunday came, she spoke from the heart, about carrying grief, about finding courage in unexpected places, and about how opening your heart, even a crack, can let in all the light you thought you'd lost forever. Emily flourished, surrounded by friends, her loneliness dissolving. She wrote a letter to her mother, telling her about Ghost, about Grace, about the laughter that now filled her days. She tucked the letter under a stone by the big oak, confident that somehow her mother would know she was safe and happy. Ghost, for his part, became a local legend. People who'd once shunned him now stopped by just to stroke his mane or slip him a carrot. Children sat in the grass at his feet, listening to Grace's stories or reading poems aloud. Some said the horse even smiled, his once haunted eyes now full of gentle wisdom. With each passing week, the Whitaker farm grew stronger, not just in buildings or numbers, but in spirit. The pain and suspicion of the past faded, replaced by warmth and trust. Grace knew that trouble might come again. Life was never without risk. But she also knew, deep down, that she would never face it alone. One evening, as the sun slipped behind a quilt of golden clouds, Grace, Emily, and Ghost stood together in the paddock, surrounded by laughter and the music of cicadas. Grace looked at her family, old and new, and felt something she'd almost forgotten: peace. The land was scarred, but it was also beautiful. Ghost, once a symbol of loss, was now the beating heart of a home reborn. Grace whispered a thank you to the prairie wind, knowing that every soul, no matter how wounded, could find its way back to belonging. Autumn faded into a quiet Kansas winter. The fields stripped bare, the sky wide and pale as bone. The mornings came cold and clear, dusted with frost, and every breath lingered in the air like memory. The rhythm of life on the Whitaker farm was steady now. Daily chores, laughter from the barn, the gentle thud of hooves on frozen ground. For the first time in years, Grace found herself savoring the slowness of the season. The farm, once a place of lonely echoes, now pulsed with the warmth of belonging. Children's boots trailed muddy prints from the porch to the paddock, Neighbors stopped in for coffee, or just to watch Ghost graze as if he were some living legend. Emily, with her hair always wild and her cheeks flushed from the cold, became a fixture at Grace's side. On a snowy Saturday, Grace sat in her old rocker by the kitchen window, looking out at Ghost, who stood like a sentinel at the fence, his breath rising in plumes. She thought about all that had changed, and all she had learned since the day she'd first seen him at auction. Nothing but skin and bones and sorrow, a living ghost. She realized that Ghost had taught her more than she'd ever expected. Not just about horses or grief or survival, but about the true power of compassion, the kind that reaches across pain and time, refusing to give up. She understood, in a way she never had before, that you couldn't force healing, not in animals or in people. You could only offer patience, forgiveness, and a place to belong. She remembered the moment, not so long ago, when she'd almost given in to doubt. The nights when the wind rattled the windows, when the world seemed ready to swallow her whole. In those moments, it had been Ghost's silent strength, Emily's stubborn hope, and the kindness of a few brave souls that kept her going. The past would always be part of her. There would always be pain, always loss, but she could choose to honor it, not be imprisoned by it. That winter, Grace began writing again, filling the margins of old notebooks with poetry and stories. She wrote about the prairie, about love that lingers in footprints and barnwood, about second chances and the strange, stubborn magic of hope. Some evenings, she read aloud to Emily and the other children who now visited regularly. They'd gather by the stove with mugs of cocoa, Ghost's head sometimes peeking through the window, as if listening too. Emily changed too. The shy, lonely girl grew into a leader. Inspired by the kindness she'd found at Grace's farm, Emily started a youth group at the little church, a place for kids who felt lost, or out of place, or just needed somewhere safe. She called it the Second Chance Club. They cleaned stalls, painted fences, helped care for stray dogs and cats that found their way to the sanctuary. Grace watched with pride as Emily spoke at the club's first meeting, her voice clear and sure. Sometimes what's broken isn't gone forever, Emily told them. Sometimes it just needs someone to believe in it, and a little time to heal. The community, once suspicious, now rallied around them. The sheriff helped organize a food drive. Pastor Mitchell donated more books and warm blankets. Martha Evans, whose warning had started the town's doubts, arrived one day with a box of full blankets and a quiet apology. "You proved us all wrong, Grace," she admitted, her eyes soft. "Maybe we all needed a second chance." Ghost, the heart of it all, seemed to sense his purpose. He walked the fences with children, tolerated tangled ribbons in his mane, stood calm as a stone when old ranchers came to study him. He had become more than a horse. He was a lesson in survival, a symbol of what can happen when you meet pain with kindness. One day, as a gentle snow fell, Grace led Emily and a group of children into the fields to scatter seeds for winter birds. The world was silent except for the crunch of boots and the distant whicker of horses. Grace paused, feeling the enormity of her gratitude. She was no longer defined by what she'd lost, but by what she had chosen to build. Patiently, stubbornly, day after day. That night, Grace sat by the fire. Ghost's halter hung on the wall beside her. She thought about legacy, what it really meant. Not bloodlines or money or what people said at the end, but the traces you left in others' hearts. The courage to forgive, the patience to try again, the love that outlives even the hardest winters. She wrote in her journal, We cannot mend the world all at once, but we can mend what's in front of us: a horse, a child, a broken heart. With enough patience and faith, what we mend might one day become a legacy, a sanctuary for others who come behind us, looking for a place to belong. That entry became her guide. She pinned it on the kitchen wall, and when hard days returned, as they always did, she read it aloud, reminding herself and Emily that hope, like healing, was a practice. In the months that followed, the farm became a true sanctuary, not just for lost animals, but for anyone who needed a new beginning. People arrived with broken dogs, battered kittens, stories they were ashamed to tell anywhere else. Grace welcomed them all, asking for nothing but kindness in return. And so the Whitaker farm became known throughout the county as a place where lost things were found, where patience and forgiveness meant more than money or pride. Ghost, old, dignified, with a coat that gleamed silver in the winter sun, remained its gentle soul, a living lesson that no spirit is ever truly lost. Grace finally understood. Her husband's dream had survived, not in bloodlines or trophies, but in every life changed by the simple power of compassion. And as she tucked Emily in each night and watched Ghost doze in the barn, Grace whispered a promise. "We'll keep mending as long as it takes. That's how you build a legacy worth leaving." Years slipped gently over the Whitaker farm like a soft blanket of prairie snow. The land, once scorched and empty, had become a tapestry of laughter, healing, and quiet miracles. Every sunrise brought new colors: fields of wildflowers in the spring, golden grass in late summer, snowflakes glittering under a winter moon. Grace sometimes paused at her kitchen window, tea warming her hands, to marvel at how different her world had become from the hollow, haunted silence that used to dwell here. The name, the Quiet Sanctuary, came from Emily. She painted it in bold, hopeful strokes on a wide plank above the main gate, her gift for Grace's birthday, with all the kids from the Second Chance Club adding handprints in every color. The paint splatters, bright against weathered wood, became a beacon for anyone who needed a place to rest or start over. The sanctuary grew by word of mouth. People came from farther and farther. Families with lost dogs, teenagers who needed somewhere safe after a fight at home, battered Mustangs with ribs showing and eyes full of stories. Grace always made room. There was no judgment here, only chores, laughter, and the gentle routines of farm life. The old house, once echoing with ghosts, now burst with the sound of children's feet and the low, comforting nickers of horses. Ghost had aged, his coat now more silver than gray, but he was still the soul of the sanctuary. Children gathered around him in the pasture, reading stories aloud or weaving wildflowers into his mane. He moved slowly, but with dignity, his scars a badge of survival, his gaze calm and knowing. On winter mornings, Emily, bundled in scarves, would lean her head against his broad neck, telling him secrets she shared with no one else. For Grace, the sanctuary was a living legacy, a promise kept to her late husband and daughter, but also a promise made to herself. She had learned, over years of pain and healing, that home wasn't a place you built alone. It was the sum of every kindness, every second chance offered and accepted. It was the voice that said, "You belong," even when the world tried to tell you otherwise. In the evenings, after chores, Grace and Emily would sit together on the porch. Sometimes they were joined by Martha Evans or Dan McCoy, sometimes by new friends or quiet, grateful strangers who had found their way to the sanctuary's gate. They shared stories of old heartbreaks and new beginnings, of failures and surprising joys. Grace liked to end those nights with the words that had become her family's creed. No spirit is truly lost if someone has the patience to listen. One summer, a local news team visited to film a segment about the quiet sanctuary. Grace watched, both embarrassed and proud, as Emily led the crew through the barn, introducing them to each animal, every horse, every rescued cat, every dog with a story. Ghost appeared last, calm and regal, letting a toddler run his tiny hands over his nose. The story aired across the county, and soon letters and donations poured in. Sometimes a few dollars in a wrinkled envelope, sometimes a note. Thank you for reminding us that hope is real. Emily thrived in the world Grace had built for her. She became the unofficial leader of the Second Chance Club, mentoring younger kids, rescuing strays, organizing blanket drives and bake sales. She spoke at the county fair each year, telling the story of the girl who learned to trust again and the horse who taught her how. Grace, growing older, found joy in the rhythm of seasons, in small acts of grace. Teaching a new child how to braid a horse's mane, comforting a mother with gentle words, planting a fruit tree that would bear fruit long after she was gone. She wrote more, stories, poems, letters to her husband and daughter, now more full of gratitude than grief. She knew they would never truly be gone as long as love echoed in the walls and in the people who found their way to her door. Sometimes, late at night, Grace walked the quiet fields with Ghost at her side, the moon rising silver over the prairie. She'd think of the woman she used to be, lonely, afraid, almost ready to let her pain swallow her whole. And she'd smile, knowing that the hardest journeys had led her right here, to a place where wounded spirits could mend, where healing was slow but unstoppable. Winter came again, crisp and bright. Grace woke early on the morning of her 62nd birthday. The house was quiet, but not empty. She brewed tea, wrapped herself in an old quilt, and stepped outside. The world was shining, frosted grass sparkling under the rising sun, a trail of footprints leading from the porch to the barn. Inside, Emily and the children were waiting with a banner and a breakfast of homemade bread and honey. They sang, off-key and giggling, and Grace felt her heart grow so full she thought it might burst. After breakfast, she led Ghost into the yard, Emily holding his lead. The children gathered close, and Grace, her voice steady and warm, spoke the lesson she wanted them all to remember. Healing takes time. It takes empathy and the courage to open your heart, even when you're afraid. It takes believing that every soul, no matter how lost, is worthy of love and a second chance. Sometimes, salvation comes in the quietest, most unexpected forms. A broken horse, a stubborn child, a hand reaching out in the dark. If you ever lose your way, remember this: you are never alone. As the sun climbed higher, laughter spilled over the fences, blending with the song of meadowlarks and the soft sound of Ghost's hooves on the earth. The sanctuary stood as living proof that hope, nurtured with patience and love, could transform even the deepest wounds into something beautiful. And in that light, Grace knew their story was not an ending, but the beginning of a legacy that would echo, quietly but powerfully, for generations to come.